You are watching a Preserve Minneapolis video presentation celebrating the city's historic, architectural, and cultural resources through advocacy, education, and public engagement.
All right, thank you all for being here to learn about our efforts to preserve Minneapolis's Black history. I'll give you an overview and then we'll get into it. So we'll start with brief introductions. My name is Erin Que. I am a senior city planner in historic preservation at the City of Minneapolis. And I came to this project first as a consultant, and then a few years ago joined the city and have served as the city's project manager since then. And so as the project manager, I applied for grants, I managed the consultant process, I worked with our consultants and our community members, oversaw the outreach that we've done throughout this project, and also communications. And I'm really fortunate to have worked with many of the great people that we have worked with. So I'll pass it to Steve next.
Yep, I'm Steve Gallo. I'm a historian with 106 Group, the consulting group that was hired by the city, and I served as principal investigator on the project.
I'm Greg McMoore, and apparently I'm an elder from South Minneapolis now. There's some folks out there that are older than I am, and they're my elders. But this was a good experience and part of the group. So,
all right. So our agenda for the day, we will provide an overview of the project background. I know there's some non-history folks in the room, so we'll do our best to explain some of the things that we've been doing. We're going to dive more into the Minneapolis African American Historic and Cultural Context Study. I do have a physical copy of it, so this is the physical thing that we'll be talking about today. And then we're going to talk more about the African American Heritage Work Group, which is the community advisory board that Greg served on, and I know we also have at least one other member, James, in the audience who can speak to his experience. And then we're going to take a brief break to shift the lectern off the stage, move the chairs over, and then we'll do a moderated discussion and then leave some room for questions from you all. And you'll see different historic photos on the slides throughout the presentation. Some of the people will go into more detail about, others will encourage you to check out the context study or feel free to ask us questions. We are also, before we get into it, really thrilled to be here. Of course, thank you, Preserve Minneapolis. Thank you, Hennepin History Museum. 2 weeks ago, we were really honored to receive 2 Minneapolis Preservation Awards for the work on this project. And Preserve Minneapolis helps oversee that effort. And then, thank you. And then we just learned within the last week that the Minnesota Alliance of Local History Museums is honoring the project with a 2026 Minnesota History Award.
Wow.
Award ceremony to come in April. So really exciting to see that recognition. All right, so first we'll just start with what is a context study. You might know those words individually, but you may not know what that means together. So a context study is essentially a narrative about a topic. So that could be as narrow as a specific property type. Some people in the room may remember when I first started in historic preservation, I mean, I'm referring to my parents who are in the room. I did a context study on the fire stations in St. Paul from 1873 to 1930. So looking at how the buildings changed over time and how the fire department changed and how you could see that in the built environment. Then a context study can span as wide as a city, like this one, and focus on a specific cultural community. And so we're looking at historical trends, people, places, events that are tied to that history to help us understand what places might be important and might be physical representations of significant events. And the city knew that this particular context study on African Americans was needed because the vast majority of our landmarks and historic districts in Minneapolis reflect European American history. And so they are well represented in terms of the really fancy buildings that are beautiful and have been done by master architects, but they don't tell the full story of Minneapolis. The city also knew that it was important to be able to better recognize what places might be important when development proposals came forward, when demolition was proposed, so that we can make better calls on whether or not something should be demolished. We also want to acknowledge that a lot of work has been done in the community before this particular project started, and that was a really important foundation to what we were able to bring forward. So our first phase was back in 2021 to 2022. The city received a $50,000 grant from the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund through the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the city hired Judge LeJune Lang of Lang Johnson Development, Antonia Apollinario Wilcoxon from Equity Strategies LLC, and then 106 Group to lead that engagement. At that time, we held 6 two-hour-long Zoom meetings on various topics, which might sound long, but they were really well-attended, really rich stories brought forward, and it helped us then create an outline for the context study and identify 7 themes to build the context study around. And then also part of that effort, we started mapping places in Minneapolis that were tied to Black history so that we could see how this history played out in physical places. And then the next phase was to actually write the context study. So we started in 2024. We were fortunate to receive a $67,500 legacy grant through the Minnesota Historical Society. And the city matched that grant with $5,250. We hired 106 Group, who also had 2 technical advisors as a part of their team, Denise Pike and Judge LeJune Lang. And they took that outline from the first phase and expanded it much further, did a lot of research, and wrote the physical context study that we have here today. We also formed the African American Heritage Work Group, and so part of that work was to meet with community members, consult with them, and help them, or have them guide us through the process. And then we did what's called an architectural history survey. So the work group picked 25 properties for our consultants to study to see, are these places that are worthy of historic designation? The context study was finished in June of 2025. And in addition to the physical copy that I have here today, we also have it online on our website. There is a physical copy here at Hennepin History Museum. We have copies at various branches of the Hennepin County Library, and we have some librarians in the audience today as well. We also have it at the Minnesota Historical Society, the Givens Collection at the U, and maybe there will be more places to come in the future. We recognize that as a 200-page document, it maybe isn't the most accessible to a lot of folks, so we created what we call the chapter summaries, and they are along the shelf here on the side of the room. There's one for each of the themes, and the copies are also all online, but they are basically a one-page handout to help you get to know the broad historical trends. So we hope you'll check those out, maybe take a copy, feel free to share it with someone. And then our current phase is National Register documentation. So we were fortunate to also receive a $75,000 grant from the National Park Service Underrepresented Communities Grant in 2024. It is still going, despite any flags that you might have in your head for the name of that grant program. And we're really excited to be working with several consultants from 106 Group, Hess Royce, and New History to do 3 National Register nominations. So the 3 buildings pictured here will be nominated to the National Register. Hopefully by early next year, everything will be official if all goes to plan. The Minnesota Spokes and Recorder Building is the home of the oldest and longest running Black newspaper in the city and the state. The Phyllis Wheatley Community Center is a really beloved community hub that celebrated its 100th anniversary last year. And then the Harry Davis Sr. and Charlotte Davis home is the home of an important community member. Harry Davis Sr. was also the first Black candidate for mayor in Minneapolis. We're also doing what's called a multiple property documentation form. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it lays out the requirements to list properties in the National Register associated with this theme. So hopefully we can use that to nominate even more places in the future. And I think my favorite part of what we're doing now is we've been able to add oral history interviews to the project so that many important community members who know this history can help add their perspective to the documentation of these places. So with that, I will pass it to Steve to tell you more about the context study.
All righty. So as Erin mentioned, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the scope of the project. I'm going to discuss some insights into the technical team's approach for developing it, and then I'm going to zoom in, try to discuss some specific content that emerged from the study. I'll really just be scratching the surface of what we covered in the study, so I'd encourage you to bring your questions to the Q&A. There's plenty more to talk about than what I'm going to cover here. So to start, the primary focus of the context study was a narrative history of the Black experience in Minneapolis, spanning from the early 1800s to the present. As you might imagine, that's a huge scope of work to cover within a single document, and it brought inherent challenges from a technical perspective. Primary among them was figuring out what to focus on, what information to include, and maybe more challenging, what not to include. While the narrative history consisted of the bulk of the project, the study also provided recommendations for future work. Those included how to apply preservation frameworks, like Erin mentioned. Those are at the local, state, and national level. We included a summary of community recommendations, priorities for future work, and avenues for further research. So to summarize, our goal was to both present the history and then provide guidance on how to apply a historic preservation framework to it. So as I mentioned, there was a large scope of work with the subject matter that brought inherent challenges, but luckily the first phase of work that Erin mentioned, that phase 1 community engagement study, laid a really strong foundation for us to work on. The main thing to come out of that was 7 themes, which the community group identified, which we then used to structure the narrative history. Those included arrival, residential life and neighborhoods, religion and houses of worship, employment and professional growth, community, social organizations, recreation and education, arts, design, music, and culture, segregation, discrimination, civil rights, and reclamation. So that structure was helpful in terms of guiding my team's focus. Rather than trying to write one comprehensive history that spanned 1800 to the present, we were able to break up this really complex history into discrete chapters that were based on these themes with the time frame spanning each chapter. So for example, the arrival chapter focuses specifically on that theme from 1800 to 2025. Then we do the same thing for residential life and neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. We had a team of 5 historians, including myself, who worked on the project, and our approach was to have each member take one or more of those themes, conduct research on it, and then draft their respective chapters based on it. We shared information and ideas along the way, so we made sure that if there was relevant information in somebody's theme that might relate to another theme, we could incorporate that. And then we ultimately combined everything into a comprehensive narrative. The central goal of that process was to have these chapters talk to each other rather than stand in isolation. The idea was that by doing so, we'd be able to draw out historical patterns that emerge across chapters. So for example, I'm going to focus on one such pattern and show you how that kind of echoed across multiple chapters throughout the study. So we're going to look at displacement, the process of Black Minneapolitans being forced out of particular geographical locations, spaces, opportunities, institutions. This was something that came up over and over again across the different chapters of the study, so I think it's a really good example for us to look at. So we can see displacement show up in the arrival chapter with regard to the Great Migration. This is the term used to describe the period of mass internal migration of Black Americans from the South to the North, roughly between 1910 and 1970. It's during this period that Minneapolis sees a dramatic spike in its Black population as new arrivals are being pushed out of the South by political, social, economic pressures, and ultimately choosing Minneapolis as a place to start a new life. So this idea of forced movement or relocation is something that emerges right off the bat in the study, and we can see it really at the root of the kind of formation of the modern Black community in Minneapolis. We can see displacement in the residential life and neighborhoods chapter, both on the individual scale as well as on the community scale. There are numerous stories of Black families moving into predominantly white neighborhoods in Minneapolis, only to be forced out by their white neighbors. The most well-known of these is probably Arthur and Edith Lee, who moved into a small house at 4600 Columbus Avenue in South Minneapolis in 1931. They faced widespread and concerted efforts by many white Minneapolitans to force them out of their home. Displacement is also visible at the community level within this chapter, as Black enclaves are seen being established, thriving, and then ultimately disrupted by various external forces. I think one of the most striking examples of this is the old Southside neighborhood in South Minneapolis. This is roughly bound by 34th and 46th Streets East in Chicago and Nicollet Avenues. So this was the center of the Black middle class for much of the 20th century until Interstate I-35W was routed through the heart of it in 1959. This not only physically displaced many of the residents, demolishing their homes, forcing them to live elsewhere, it also had profound economic impacts on the neighborhood as well, many of which are still with us today. So in the religion and houses of worship chapter, we can see displacement in the fact that Black churches are repeatedly forced to relocate due to external pressures. St. James AME Church, for example, occupied by our count at least 9 different locations from the time it was established in 1863 until it found its permanent home in 1959. The same pattern repeats in the community social organizations, recreation, and education chapter, where we see central social institutions such as the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House relocate multiple times due to threats of demolition or shifting settlement patterns. It's in the arts, design, music, and culture chapter as well. For those of you who don't know, Minneapolis had a thriving jazz scene in the 1920s and 1930s. This was really focused on a cluster of clubs and bars at 6th Street North and Lyndale Avenue. None of those buildings survive today. They've all been demolished. Within the employment and professional growth chapter, displacement is visible in the purging of Black employees from the Minneapolis Fire Department in the early 20th century. The fire department was a really unique means of stable and lucrative employment for Black men in particular during the late 19th century and early 20th century. The department was eventually segregated in 1907. They forced every Black employee to be housed in a single firehouse, and then it was eventually purged of all Black employees in the preceding decade. It remained an all-white fire department until it was forced by court decree to integrate in 1970s. Finally, the segregation, discrimination, civil rights, and reclamation chapter focuses a great deal on the idea of displacement, namely in examining the efforts of various individuals, such as Lena O. Smith, a civil rights attorney, to actively push back on the forces that are causing displacement that we look at in all the other chapters. Lena O. Smith, for example, was the lawyer who represented Arthur and Edith Lee as they were trying to remain in their home on Columbus Avenue. So again, there are many historical patterns that can be found throughout the study, but I want to give you a representative example of a particularly visible through line that we found throughout the study. The beauty of this thematic approach that we took to the study, in my opinion, is that by having these chapters overlap, echo, talk to one another, it allows these patterns to emerge, and it gives the readers an opportunity to draw larger conclusions about the Black experience in Minneapolis. Another great thing about this thematic structure is that it allowed us to demonstrate the breadth and impact of specific individuals. Just like historical patterns repeated across the 7 themes, significant people pop up time and time again in each chapter. This speaks to both their importance within the community as well as their multifaceted and complex historical impacts. 2 prime examples of these individuals are A.B. Cassius and Lena O. Smith, who I mentioned earlier. You can see on this slide the various chapters in which each of those people pops up in the study. Cassius was a prominent entrepreneur. Excuse me. He operated several bars and restaurants in the city, such as Dreamland Cafe in South Minneapolis and Cassius Club Cafe in downtown, both of which were popular and long-standing gathering places for Black Minneapolitans. When Cassius Club and Cafe opened in 1947, he became the first Black person in Minneapolis to hold a liquor license. But his impacts were far beyond his business activities. He was also a labor organizer, a civic leader, a civil rights activist. In the 1920s, for example, he led a unionization effort at the Curtis Hotel to demand pay increases for Black waiters to bring them in line with their white counterparts. He was a member of the local branches of the NAACP and the Urban League. He was a founding member of the Minnesota Club, which was an association of Black business people. He was a board member for The Way, which was a social services center for Black youth. And he was president of the Nakarima Club, which was a social club and music venue in South Minneapolis. Smith, on the other hand, was an attorney and leading advocate for African-American civil rights in Minneapolis. When she was accepted to the bar in 1921, she became the first Black woman to practice law in the state of Minnesota and remained the only one until 1945. She was often focused on helping Black Minneapolitans stay in their home in the face of discriminatory housing practices. As I noted previously, she represented Arthur and Edith Lee, but she was also the primary attorney for the Minneapolis NAACP and served as its president. She was a member of the Minneapolis Urban League, and she brought civil rights cases against prominent institutions such as the University of Minnesota Nursing School and the Nicollet Hotel. And she also led a push to integrate segregated seating sections in the Pantages Theater. So again, these are just a couple examples of prominent individuals that show up in different ways across the study. And again, one of the best parts of the study in my mind is that it shows the impact of such people expanding beyond one specific area of life. You know, there's a tendency within history to put prominent individuals within a box, say this is their historic contribution and that's that, but this is really an opportunity to show how they expand beyond those bounds and contribute in many different ways to the community. Okay, with that, I think I'll hand it back to Erin.
So a really critical and I would say essential part about this project has been our partnerships with community members to tell these stories. There's a phrase maybe often said among historians now, there's nothing about us without us. And so as the city looked to uplift and better recognize and document the history of Black Minneapolitans, it's important to recognize and acknowledge who is or isn't doing that work and how can we make sure community voices are incorporated in that. So in the first phase, the community engagement was led by community members. And then as we went into the second phase to write the context study, we wanted to make sure community members could still be involved. And so we worked with the city council and the mayor to form the African American Heritage Work Group. We had 15 community members volunteer to serve on this group, of which Greg is one of those members. And their names are listed here, and I want to shout them out since this is being recorded. So the 15 who served include Daniel Bergen, James Curry, Kendra Elner, Tierra Farad, the late Michelle Gibson, who sadly passed away while we were working together, Minister Dr. Ora Hoax, Denise Jameson, Brian Kelly, Michelle Lincoln, Greg McMoore, Julia Maturi, Beverly Propes, Davu Seru, Tanae Wells, and Keegan Zavi. And it was really I think the highlight of working on this project was getting to work with these community members and use their perspectives to make sure that the context study reflected the history and the events as they understood it from their lived experiences. And we were really lucky to have an intergenerational group of people choose to serve on this work group as well, so that we could get all of these different perspectives. So their main tasks were to advise on the research that was done, to review and comment on the context study, and then they worked together and decided which sites across Minneapolis would get to be surveyed and studied to see if they are historically significant. And then they helped push beyond what we had imagined, and they came up with this really great and rich list of how else African American and Black heritage can be recognized beyond designating places as historically important. So with that, I'll pass it to Greg to tell a little bit more about your experience on the work group.
Before I get started, you have to know that when Erin calls or reaches out, it's well worth your time to answer, okay? This group was a wonderful experience, or this experience was just wonderful, and important, because our story as African Americans on the south side, on the north side here in Minneapolis, it hasn't been told enough. And that is what this project helped us do. It helped us tell the story of who we are. And it's very timely because the people who lived the experience were there to share that experience with many. You know, there's the researchers that do it, and I'm not knocking that. There's other folks who do, you know, the background work on this. But for the folks who live the experience, that's invaluable information. And that's one of the pieces of this project which should not be taken for granted. The structure of the project, you could almost use this as though it was a best practice for the way that the city, the way that Erin pulled it together. It gave folks from the north side and the south side, and it's important that I let you know I'm a south sider, because there are those little rivalries, right? But it was very motivational, very inspirational for me to have to be part of this or to want to be part of this. At times there were little rivalries. You know, we're going to put our chest forward and we're going to make a case for my home, the South Side, and I'm sure the folks who lived over north are going to do the same thing, did the same thing. We broke off into small groups so that we could decide which projects or which sites were going to be brought forth. It was like a grading process also, but it also gave us an opportunity just to discuss what we thought was the most important sites to be created or to be brought forth. As you can see, Mr. Harry Davis, I still call him Mr. Harry Davis because he was my elder and his family. Their home is over on Portland Avenue. Of course, the Minnesota spokesman, which was very, very prominent in our community and an important voice for the African American community. And then, of course, Phyllis Wheatley on the north side. So when we talk about my experience, when Erin called, it was important to be there because it gave us an opportunity to tell the story. As a child, I grew up right across the road from here over on right just east of 4th Avenue, 416 East 25th Street. My home, my family's home was taken by the freeway that went through. If you look at that freeway, you can look at almost the migration of black folks out to South Minneapolis. Right about 1959, I can remember when I told this story to folks in the group. In 1959, when everybody was living in our home back then, my father, my uncle, everybody, the state came and took our home away from us. And at that point, many of us, all of us, kind of went off in different directions. It broke up our family. Those were the kind of stories that came forth in our discussion sessions. It was an intergenerational group. It was a group of Northsiders and Southsiders. It brought out the different characteristics of the communities. So I took great pride in being part of this group, and it was important work to be done. What else came out of this? Right now, we're talking about how to revitalize in my community on the South Side. How can we revitalize it? Everybody knows what has recently took place with George Floyd over on 38th in Chicago, with Renee Good over on Park Avenue. I still live in one of my family's homes on 35th and 4th. When we all got together, and when you see some of the faces of the folks up there, like Mr. Cassius, and the list can go on. If you see the picture of Central High School, Minnesota spokesman, if you want to think about 38th Street and 4th Avenue, that was our commerce center. We didn't have to leave our neighborhood because everything was right there. Those were the kind of stories that came out of this experience, and those were the challenges of trying to figure out which sites we were going to honor. Right now, there's an effort in South Minneapolis to create what we're calling right now a pocket park, which is right there on 38th Street and 4th Avenue. There's space there where we're talking about how can the city, how can our community, how can we honor what the community was. We hope that will lead to, I hope that it will lead to designation of different historic sites in South Minneapolis, basically along 4th Avenue. Everything from the Nakarima Club to where Central High School was, where the Pocket Park, the businesses along 38th Street. And what also has grown out of this is, for instance, St. Peter's AME Church, where I go, down on 41st and 4th Avenue. The 106 group, Erin, we've all worked to try to figure out or to get the wheel going in terms of having that particular church, which opened its doors in 1888, I think just behind St. James, designated a National Historic Site. And we're well on the way to getting that done. That church, my church, is one block from where the Tilsonville homes were in 4th Avenue. So now I'm giving you an idea of what these conversations were like once a month in downtown Minneapolis. And the Northsiders have just as much to talk about in terms of their community over there and what should be honored. So this experience was a good experience, and it opened the door for future work to be done. I mentioned George Floyd and 38th Street in Chicago. Well, I think there's an opportunity to start revitalizing all of South Minneapolis, starting at 38th Street and 4th Avenue. That's the hope of a committee that we're working with right now. So I'm understanding there's going to be questions a little bit later on, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what my experience was like on this with the group, how important the work was, some of the challenges that we had to identifying the spots, but I jump at the opportunity to do it again here. So, thank you.
All right, we'll definitely talk more about that in a moment, but I am going to finish up our slides so we can then change our logistics up here and get more into conversation with each other and then with you all. So in this picture, there's the work group members and also former City Council member Andrea Jenkins, and I want to share a quote that she said upon the conclusion of the work. I'll read it aloud for you all, just to be thinking about as we continue the conversation. So, quote, "At a time in our nation when African American history is literally being erased, it is so critical that we take these moments to identify, and not only identify, but to solidify and formalize these historical sites, historical actions that have taken place in the city of Minneapolis." And so we hope you might hold that with you as we continue the conversation forward, to think about why it's important to be documenting this history, and also how it can have an impact in the future beyond just being something that you read. There are a whole list of folks that have been involved in this project that I want to give some thanks to. Again, giving kudos to the community historians who wrote a lot of the work that became a foundation of what Steve and his team wrote. We had technical experts, Judge LeJune Lang, Antonia Apollinario Wilcoxon, and Denise Pike. Thank you, of course, to the African American Heritage Work Group. A whole team of historians at 106 Group writing different chapters, as Steve explained. Various staff at the city council, and the mayor have been involved in supporting the work. In surveying the different properties, we worked closely with the property owners so that they could give their buy-in and learn about this process. And many were excited to know about the historical connections of their houses that they might not have known before. And we had a lot of support from the preservation community. So the Minnesota Historical Society, the State Historic Preservation Office, our Heritage Preservation Commission, many more than I could show on this slide. But it's really been a team effort to bring this into life, and also recognize that this is a document, it's a moment in time that it was published, and there are so many more stories that can and should be told in the future. So with that, I think we'll pause, and I'll look to August and John to help with our logistical switch here. Okay, so Greg provided a really nice intro to his experience on the work group. I think it's important, I know this was a focus of how the lecture was advertised, to talk a little bit more about how community members and technical professionals work together. From my perspective as a city staff member, I think it was important, and again, kind of critical path to figure out how do we build trust among this group of people who, some people might have known each other, others didn't. We have city staff members, and so the city kind of represents an institution that there may be mixed feelings about, and then we also have consultants who might be seen a bit as outsiders in this process. And so, I think it was really important from my perspective to make sure that the community members had as much power in decision making as possible, given that we're within the framework of doing a project for the city, funded by different levels of government, that sort of thing. And also that the community members felt their input was heard and taken seriously as we shaped this project. We didn't want it to be a checking the box activity, as they say, that we could just say, oh, well, we talked to Greg, we're good. Wanted to make sure that they knew they could trust us to steward these stories and this history in a respectful way. So, Steve, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how the community input from the work group helped shape the study.
Yeah, I would say in a number of ways. I think first and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge what Greg mentioned about lived experience being brought into this study. We, at 106 Group, the consultant team was coming into this knowing that we have a specific perspective, especially coming into this project as a white person with a team of non-Black historians, right? That is a specific position and perspective that we need to grapple with as we're developing this. And, that comes with limitations. And this was a really amazing opportunity to try to circumvent that pitfall or potential pitfall. So bringing that lived experience into that was crucial. So not only did it help us check our implicit bias or our blind spots, but it also helped us overcome what historians often refer to as silences of the archive. So it may not be a surprise to folks in this room, but there is a wide disparity between who is represented within historical resources. Not because those resources don't exist, but because the way they are collected and preserved is influenced by those who do the collecting and the preserving. So we were coming into this with the understanding that a lot of the information that we were going to want to write about may not be readily available to us through our normal avenues of research. So having a group of people who live the history that we're talking about, who have intimate understandings of it, was an invaluable resource for us as we were trying to work through things. But again, I think also perspective as well. We had a lot of great sources that we could work from, but the work group was a great resource for us to bring that information to and give them the opportunity to be like, well, that's not quite right. Maybe that's not quite how it happened, or maybe that's not the way we should be interpreting that. So it was a really great counterbalance to, I think, the work that we were doing.
Yeah. So Greg, what do you think went well? What kept you coming back each time? And maybe what are some of the challenges that you alluded to a few minutes ago?
What I appreciated the most, I look at things and say that we all come from different backgrounds. Okay? I look very much in terms of race, class, and culture. One of the pieces that I really appreciated when I came down there was the willingness to hear what other people said. The folks here provided the structure for us to speak into, to be part of. But so often, it's just taken for granted that, okay, I know what that person's talking about. So it's like, it's just a matter-of-fact conversation, when in fact it's not. What I appreciate was the sensitivity that folks who weren't part of the community were able to bring to it when they listened to folks express their ideas or talk about who they were. Now, I will say this. Often, I'm in conversations where folks want to know who I am without me hearing who they are. That's uncomfortable for me. It kind of is what it is. I can come back at them. Choose not to do that. But whenever I've worked with 106 group with Steve, whenever I've worked with Erin, there's that sense that, this is an exchange of ideas. I don't know everything about you. You can tell me that. You may not know everything about me, but I'm willing to share that. I'm constantly asking Steve about, being an architect. What is that all about? Where do you come from? Who are you? And I've done that with Erin as well. And in the group setting, we were able to have those kind of conversations, even with ourselves. As I mentioned, I'm a Southsider. There's folks on the North Side, and sometimes those conversations get a little bit of a challenge. But we all know each other. We know where we came from. So, this work experience gave us the opportunity to touch base with people, to share our information. And I've got to tell you that when asked certain questions or when talking within a group, I think that some folks need to understand that this information is very personal. It's not just something that's going to be put down in a document and researched and all that. If I'm talking about when my folks came to Minnesota from Virginia where they were enslaved, they escaped and came here in the 1860s, settled in Hastings, and then came up to the Southside. That's very, very personal stuff for me. And there's pain in that. So when in groups of people, it's important to know who you're talking about, where they came from, and a sharing of ideas and being as honest as you can. But before you do that, you have to have some type of cultural understanding. You know, the way this project was put together, we worked in small groups, we exchanged ideas. You know, even as black folks, you know, we come from different backgrounds. So those are important discussions, but they have to be pulled off in the correct way. And they have to be reported in the right way. You know, the work that I'm doing with Steve at the church, he's just, you know, he's a sponge. He's just gathering everything up. Can I have pictures? Can I have that? Can we talk about this? Can we talk? I appreciate that. You know, with Erin and I, you know, we've met in the community. We've exchanged ideas. She's collected information. The project collected information. And it was produced and put out there in a very sensitive, thoughtful way.
Thank you. Appreciate you saying that.
I got to stop before I get going, you know.
If I could just build off of that real quick, I think just on the idea of equal exchange of ideas and building trust, I think that was a really important thing for us as historians, as consultants coming into this group. I think was really important for us to establish at the outset that we were not coming to this project as authorities on the subject. We are not experts in the subject. Yes, we have technical expertise that we're bringing to this project. We know how to research, we know how to write, but we're not presenting ourselves as authorities on this information,
Correct.
right? So I think that was important for building trust, but also level setting, I think, as well, that like we need you all to help us do this, is right. So I think that was
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I think what you both are alluding to is the tendency sometimes when people are working with community to be extractive, taking that information and running with it or capitalizing on it. And, you know, to a degree, of course, we needed information from community members to be able to write the study. But there are ways that you can do it to be supportive, and there are ways that you can do it that could be harmful. And so, you know, I think some of my approach in facilitating the group was really being aware of how much time we were asking of people and how to, you know, really take on what we could outside the meeting so that when we came together in the meeting, there is a focused task to talk through together. And then if more information was needed, I could go gather that, Steve could help me with that, and then we can bring it back to the group the next time so that we are not, hopefully, taking advantage of the generosity and the time that the work group members were giving to us. Also, I think, you know, the work group met for a year. That was as long as we were allowed to meet under the resolution set forth by the city council and the mayor. And so although we aren't, you know, requiring time of our work group beyond that, there's been some natural relationships that have formed. People have continued to work together, and hopefully my emails to them aren't too annoying, but I'm trying to give them updates about what we're doing and how their work is impacting decisions that are being made, so that it's not like we met for a year and now we're done and we're moving on to the next thing. This is a sustaining effort. Steve and Greg, do you have any tips for folks in the room who might want to form partnerships between technical historians and community historians that you've learned from this process?
You know, we're living in troubled times. Like I needed to tell you that, right? And everybody's in their little bubbles, you know. And the one thing that's not taking place is taking that first step. taking that first step to reach out to somebody who doesn't look like you. You know, an exchange of ideas, have those kind of conversations. And that pretty much is what this work has done. I know it's what Erin and Steve has done just personally. You know, we took a chance with each other. And we spoke with each other and we learned from each other. There's not enough of that going on nowadays in the society, in the world that we live in. And when there's not enough of that going on, then there's suspicions that grow in a person's mind. Oh, I heard this about that person. This is what's going on. That's what's going on. You know. So it's taking that first step in reaching out to get to understand who people are. I hear so many conversations about what South Minneapolis is about. You know, with ICE being there, with George Floyd being there, with the populations changing. And I hear all this stuff from folks that don't even live there. You know? So where, you know, what is that? You don't even live here, but you're going to make all these judgments. So in many ways, personal relationships, taking that first step, reaching out, taking a chance, wow, you know, and we're not doing enough of that these days.
Yeah, I'd agree. You took you took all my ideas. From the professional perspective, I think it's also important to take chances and trust. For example, one of the members of the work group, we approached her to come on as a partner for this next phase of work, drafting one of the National Register nominations. She's not a trained historian. That's not work that she is used to doing, has no experience doing that, but we thought this was a really good opportunity to open up what is a space dominated by professionals, overeducated people like myself. And so a National Register nomination is technically supposed to be a document that can be completed by any member of the public. It is not really. In reality, it is a very technical document that has very high standards, but we took a chance on this person and we said, we really want your perspective, we really want your insights, so would you be willing to try this out? And she's doing it with us now and it's great. So something might not fit your preconceived notion of who should be doing work or how it should be done, but take a chance and bring those voices to the table.
Yep.
We also talk about compensation. Although we had hoped to be able to compensate our work group members for their time, when push came to shove, we were unable to do it. And so in turn, we were able to offer parking vouchers or transit passes, and I brought snacks to each of our meetings. A small token, but when you're meeting from 4 to 5:30, it's good to have some snacks. And understandably, it would have been much better and much more equitable to be compensating people for their time. And what we can take from that second phase into the third phase is greater intention where we have control about compensating people. So as Steve mentioned, we have a community member who's helping write one of the nominations. We have other community members who have recorded oral history interviews, and we have some folks who are going to review the nominations as well from their lived perspective. And folks are getting compensated every step of the way. So, that doesn't mean that initial meeting with someone has to be an offer of something in return, but recognize that everyone's time is important, and think about the ways you can reciprocate and thank people for their time. I think we are nearing time to switch to Q&A, so I'll ask one more question of you both. What impact has the project either had so far, or do you hope it can have in the future?
You want to keep that one?
Yeah, again, I'll say that I like to think of this project as just the start. Mr. Moore, Louis Moore knows this, and others, that I grew up in this community, and I ain't going anywhere. Okay, I'm 70 years old, Lord. And I've spent 60 of those 70 years in Minnesota and on the Southside. So the growth of my community, and right now, and lately it's been in a bit of a pause, the growth of my community is very, very important. Very important. A project like this, and conversations have said, okay, how can we take this history and not just use it as history, but use it as education and use it as a path forward? I don't believe, in my heart of hearts, that we're ever going to be able to create another African American community like we had, and I get emotional talking about this, like we had in South Minneapolis. All right? But we need to take the lessons from all those folks that helped us create that community and build that community, modify it, and work with the folks who are there to take that community forward. I mean, the people that lived in my community then were influential folks in the field of education, politics, legally, business. You go down the road. I mean, our folks would have gone upside our head if we didn't take some of those messages that they gave us and moved it forward. So this kind of study, this kind of work can help us create a path forward for the neighborhood. And I truly, truly believe that, in spite of what other folks think about 38th Street and 4th Avenue. The demographics have changed now. We have a large Latino community. There's white folks there. There's those of us who are African American that stayed there. But if we learn something from the past, if we learn something from projects like this, from the history, we take that information and mold it a little bit, put it out there and say, hey, we can make a way here. We can do something here. There's too much of this good history to just let it go away. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge these days, is to sell that idea to some folks who are not familiar with that. You look at some of the high schools, do they have civic courses in schools now? So, I don't want to, don't get me preaching.
I'd just add, I think the specific historic preservation projects that we've mentioned already, working on St. Peter's AME nomination with Greg, bringing in this community member for the next phase of work that we're working on now, those are all really exciting projects. They're all directly related to this work, so that's really exciting. But I think also to Greg's point, seeing all of the different ways that this information can be used beyond traditional historic preservation. I think one of the most energizing and exciting things for me about the work group was all the various ideas that all of the members had for ways to use this information beyond traditional historic preservation. They were talking about walking tours, they were talking about public signage and monuments and economic revitalization. So seeing that energy and that inspiration was really exciting to me. And I really want this document to be the foundation to build off of, not an endpoint. So that's.
And we've had that conversation, the two of us. Okay, here's history. Now what?
Yeah, right.
We can't just put it up on a shelf and blow the dust off on the books. Now what? How can we use it? Okay, going forward. Yeah. We've had that conversation, haven't we?
Yeah.
Back me up on that. All right.
We've talked a little bit about the National Register, and I realize I don't know that we explained it fully to the audience. Some of you may be familiar, some may not. The National Register of Historic Places is the nation's official list of the places that are important in the country. So being listed in the National Register is important on its own, right? It's recognition. But I think what's even more important is that National Register listing allows those properties to tap into economic resources, grants, tax credits, depending on the nature of the property, which can then be used to replace the roof, update your HVAC systems, help you physically preserve these places, maybe allow you funding to create an exhibit to tell the history of the place, and potentially lead to some of that economic revitalization that Greg has been talking about. So,
Yeah, I'm not going to go real public with this, but I am associated with an organization that just received a pretty good-sized grant to do everything that Erin had just talked about. Now, the deal is, it's more than just the money. You know, folks have to realize what that means and have to realize how it can be used. And that is one of the things that I've learned since connecting with historians, you know, and people who write grants and do the kind of work that y'all do, because it was going on in my head. Okay, how do we do this? And so, even from the very first time, John and I went to South Minneapolis and had a meeting, what was that, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, to talk about the whole Pocket Park thing and history and yada, yada, yada. So I thank you, because I've learned a lot about that and making money. He'd be that blunt about it, but.
yeah. All right. Well, we're happy to take questions from you all.
Yeah, and I'm going to take advantage of holding the mic.
Yeah.
I think it was 3 or 4 years, Greg, which
Was it?
underscores my question. It's really great to see how you guys figured out to do this work well. It's relationship based, it's over long term, and it just pains me to hear, okay, we had a 1 year window that we had to do this. We weren't allowed to compensate. 106 group, I assume you got to have funding and you got to go to the next project. So my question is there more that nonprofits like Preserve Minneapolis or Hennepin History Museum can do to help you with connective tissue between projects, or Hosmer Library, Sumner Library, are there local places that can help you keep those partnerships and relationships going?
Yeah, great question. We'd love you to look at chapter 3.0 of the context study, because we list all of you as partners in this. You know, our historic preservation team at the city is small, and we are focused on the National Register documentation right now, and we'd love partners to dive into the work. It doesn't have to necessarily be an official partnership with us. But there's so much that can and should be done, and our hope is that the context study document and the recommendations from work group members can help start a path or connect people, connect unlikely partners. You know, John is a nonprofit. We know you could access grants, and so maybe there's ideas that can come out from community members that you could support an effort as well. So, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd just say publicizing the information like we're doing right now, like you are in a unique position to share this information and make sure people are aware of it. That's great. But also to Erin's point, there are no shortage of ideas of what folks in the community want to do with this information and how to make it more widely available. There are a ton of interesting projects out there, not all of which we are the best fit to carry forward. So, you know, if you have people to talk to them.
I know, I was going to add one more thing, John. I know Greg has been particularly interested in how do we get this into the schools.
Big time, yeah.
So if there are any ideas in the room or connections to schools, yeah.
I've been talking with the folks over at MNHS, so we've got some ideas.
Excellent.
That we're growing.
Oh, yeah, we will talk.
I'm hoping to get specific information. I'm old enough that people told me about 4th Avenue. And people would come to town and they would say, oh, let's go over to 4th Avenue, because there were clubs there that had music. That's what I thought. But, you know, I don't know. I have never heard the name of a place. I just knew it was really important for music. I mean,
You know, I can briefly tell you, you know.
But is that the kind of thing that's been captured?
Yeah,
Yeah.
captured, you know, I lived it, so it's definitely been captured by me, but the stories
But I mean
have been
that
told,
I
yeah.
could look it up and get a list. And
Yeah, I can give you the name of the places
Yeah.
right now, but yeah.
That's what I was hoping this was all about.
So,
Because that could be,
Do you wanna
that
name
would
a couple?
disappear. There's no places.
I briefly can tell you, Lake Street and 4th Avenue was Louis, the Johnny Baker Post, kind of a party place. Then you went down and you saw Central Hosmer, but then on 38th Street was Dreamland. And Dreamland was like the spot. But then further south, 2 blocks, was the Nakarima Club. All right? And Nakarima is the word American spelled backwards. And I think we embraced that as a community. And how special that was is that's where the old dudes, my father and Mr. Bowman, all of them, that's where my rites of passage was, to go into the Nakarima on a Friday night. So, those are a couple of the big 3 or 4 of the spots all along 4th Avenue. None of them are there anymore, but yeah.
but the buildings for some
buildings
still
are-
remain.
Correct.
Yeah, so
The buildings
Dreamland
are
is
still
the
there.
northeast corner of 38th and 4th. It's a pale yellow building. And then the Nakarima is a church. It's a small church.
Nakarima's a church, yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the professional historians there could cite maybe 1 or 2 surprising things that you found out from the community members that which maybe even shocking things that, like, for example, when you mentioned just kind of offhandedly that there was a colored section in the Pantasias, I was appalled. I just, naive little white guy like me, I'm thinking, oh, that only happened in the South. But can you cite a couple of those kinds of things that may have surprised you?
Wow. Yeah, a lot of them. But I think to your point, generally, right, there is this perception that Minnesota's in the north. It's a progressive state, right? That these things didn't happen here, but the study makes clear that they very much did. So I think yes, the codified segregation was, to the extent to which that was around, was very surprising. I think the residential segregation was very surprising, especially in South Minneapolis, seeing how strict the
Covenants.
the racial covenants, yes, but also that kind of unofficial color line. What is it? Is it 46th Street? Was essentially
42nd.
42nd.
Do they call it the gauze curtain? I heard somebody say that when I was in college.
Oh, I haven't heard
So
that.
they went, that's why they put the freeway right up there. They knew where it was, so they could put the freeway on.
Well, anybody who thinks that that freeway going through is just coincidental is ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's not, but.
So I think those things were quite shocking to see how prevalent that was. But just I think some of the stories of just specific individuals were really surprising. Ida Dorsey was somebody who popped up in the study that I was really fascinated by. She was a madam of a brothel in Minneapolis in the late 19th century. And she was like pretty notorious too. She ran a brothel that catered to interracial clientele. Was constantly getting harassed by the police, was like popping up in newspapers all the time. She also put on entertainment, so there was can dancing there, which was outlawed at the time. But this is a period in time where, employment opportunities for women generally, let alone black women, were extremely limited. But this woman is popping up as this really successful entrepreneur and doing all these amazing things. And then to get back to this idea of importance kind of touching in different areas. So there's that significance of her brothel, which is near downtown, but that same building was used as the headquarters of a social club for black railroad workers. It was also a barber shop was housed in there that was run by a black barber. It was used as a hotel. So you can see so many different aspects of this history in one specific building that I thought was really fascinating.
One thing, I don't know whether it's shocking or more painful, is when I was a kid, if you went from 38th Street and let's say Nicollet over to 38th Street in Chicago, maybe Bloomington, along that corridor, there was 13 to 14 businesses that were, by and large, owned and operated by black folks. Everything from landscaping to grocery stores, record stores, barber shops, laundromats, and the list goes on. And so when I talk about not having to leave the community, the dollars stayed right there in the community, okay? Up the block was Central High School, right? Bryant Junior High School, Warrington, the churches of it. You had all the elements that make a community, a thriving community. And let me tell you, the Southside was a thriving community. There's none of that anymore. So I don't know whether that falls into the category of shocking or painful, sad. Yeah, and like I said, you know, I was baptized in St. Peter's Church in 1953, and here it is 2025, and so I've, for the most part, lived through all of that.
I'm just going to make one more shameless plug for the exhibit upstairs. Eliza Winston was brought up here as an enslaved woman in 1860. The state of Minnesota was 2 years old, but this tension was baked in from day one. Our Constitution said there is no slavery in this state, but slavery was rampant. We welcomed slaveholders from the South to come up here and bring their human property with them. She got in front of a judge. The judge said, the Constitution's pretty clear, you're free. And then there was rioting in the streets because they were like, you're going to kill our livelihood. So the tension of Minnesotans from the first days of, are we going to do what's right? Are we going to do what's right for our pocketbooks? It's a fascinating story, and it's been playing out ever since. So anyway, and we've got books to sell too if you want to read about it. The exhibit was based on scholarship of Dr. Christopher Lehman up at St. Cloud. No, this is Slavery's Reach was his first book, and his second book is It Took Courage, the story of Eliza Winston. So we've got them both here if you're interested.
Just want to say congrats to all you guys. This is an excellent project that I've been following for a while. I guess I have two questions primarily. I guess having seen the National Register application form and all of the criteria that goes into that, I am curious how this project might have an impact on changing the structure of the document itself in terms of the categories that you were allowed to select for the documentation, because the ones I've seen have primarily Euro-American and Indigenous, maybe French, but there is nothing categorically, at least from the last several I've seen, that include African American of any kind. So do you think that this project, or what results from this project, could potentially have an impact on adding those categories to the form? And then the second thing is, I work as part of the archaeology crew at 106, and naturally that always poses the question of, now that you guys have a substantial list, is there any discussion about further investigation beyond architectural? Are there areas that could potentially be of interest for archaeological excavation?
It's great questions. For the first one, there is a category of significance that is the technical terminology for the National Register is ethnic heritage / black. So there is a category that does recognize significance in terms of whether or not this will influence revisions to the National Register documentation. We can dream. We can dream. I mean, there is I think a lot that can be said for ways that documentation can be revised, but also I think to make it more publicly accessible, I think would be the big revision I would want to see. Again, when it was created, the National Register is supposed to be a publicly accessible forum where anybody can nominate a property. Like I said, it is not that in reality. So in terms of revisions, I would like to see personally opening that system up to non-professional historians, I think would be a lofty goal.
That being said, through the multiple property documentation form, it's going to lay out, it's called registration requirements to list a property in Minneapolis tied to Black history on the National Register. And so it'll say like, you know, an example would be the home of a person who had a significant impact in X. And so it will hopefully make it a little bit easier to identify the places that could be nominated. You know, at the end of the day, as Steve was explaining, you still do need a technical historian to write a successful nomination. But hopefully that might encourage more partnerships between, you know, community institutions that want to see their property registered and technical historians who can provide that expertise. I think the second question probably falls in my court about whether or not we'll explore archaeology in the future. Our team at the city does not include any archaeologists, so that is not an expertise that we have. I can't say for certain whether or not that's something we would explore in the future, but this could also be a great opportunity, as John was alluding to earlier, for partnerships, or, you know, as you might look at this project from your perspective, you might see avenues to pursue where we could uplift that a little bit more. I know it's challenging with archaeology because a lot of the places have been demolished, and then in many cases something new built on top of it. So that means the ground has been disturbed, and that might impact how you could do that investigation.
I'd also add that, I mean, this is something that we discussed a lot with the work group, is how do we recognize buildings that were very important to the community but no longer exist. Those are not something that we can nominate to the National Register, but you know, this is where those novel ideas of historic preservation beyond traditional nominations come in, right? There are different ways that we can recognize those buildings that are no longer there, but are nonetheless important to the story.
Hi. I would like to encourage people, if you're interested, to read the nomination form for the Hiawatha Golf Course, which is a civil rights, African American history site. It's coming up for destruction, which may still be stopped. But I have to say it's the best written nomination form I ever read. And if you started on page about 60 where the narrative is, it's a story. It's like a history article, and you don't have to play golf to understand it. But they explain why within the world of golf the course is important. But I think your group did that. It's just a wonderful document.
That was not us, but
Hess Royce and Company, yeah.
How would somebody find that?
Would love to
read that.
Yeah, let's see, is that one online in the National Register database? It should be. If it isn't yet, my business cards are at the end of the documents here. You can send me an email, and I'm happy to link you to that document.
Is there anything still existing from the Lena Smith time, or any of the buildings, or where she lived, or because I think that would be an important thing to.
Her home.
Yes. Yeah. So her house is on the National Register. It's also a local landmark, so it's regulated by the city. And recently, a street was renamed after her. So Edmund Boulevard was renamed Lena Smith Boulevard. So she doesn't actually have a tie to that street, but now her name is part of the story.
You guys talked a little bit about the real estate issues in South Minneapolis. I just want to briefly mention that there's a documentary about me and my wife. We bought our house on 44th and Columbus, and we were the first black family to move in on the block. And Daniel Bergen came out to our house and did a documentary. And I would encourage people to take a look at that. It's on the Jim Crow of the North series. And it was quite an experience, and there were quite a few things said by neighbors that were quite interesting. And I'm not going to go into all those details, but I'm old enough to remember that, you know, people didn't really enjoy having black folks move in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, all right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for watching this Preserve Minneapolis presentation. To learn more or to donate, go to preserveminneapolis.org.